Henry sat in his old beat-up car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as the rain pounded against the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists. The wind howled through the city streets, shaking streetlights and rattling windows. It was one of the worst storms of the season, the kind that made people stay inside, huddled under blankets with hot coffee, while the unlucky few who had to be out in it hurried through the rain, desperate for shelter. Henry wasn't hurrying anywhere. He had nowhere to be. For months he had been looking for work, applying to every job he could find, only to be met with silence or rejection. His savings had run dry, and the weight of unpaid bills pressed against his chest like a heavy stone. He had been a driver before, and he figured he could be one again, but even that wasn't going well. Every door seemed to close before he could step through. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath fog up the window. As he wiped the glass with his sleeve, his eyes caught a figure on the sidewalk. An elderly woman, frail and hunched over, clutching a thin shawl around her shoulders. Her small frame trembled in the relentless storm as she struggled to walk. Every gust of wind threatened to knock her down. Without thinking, Henry opened his door and ran toward her, his feet splashing through puddles. "Ma'am," he called out, "are you okay?" The woman turned toward him, her face lined with deep wrinkles, her eyes filled with exhaustion and fear. I was trying to get home," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "But the buses stopped running, and I don't think I can make it alone." "Come with me," Henry said gently, taking her by the arm. "I'll drive you home." The woman hesitated for only a moment before nodding. She was too tired, too cold to argue. He guided her into the passenger seat, turned up the heat, and handed her his only dry jacket. She looked at him with grateful eyes but said nothing. As he pulled away from the curb, Henry glanced at her from the corner of his eye. She was rubbing her hands together for warmth, her breathing slow and uneven. "Where do you live?" he asked. She gave him an address across town, far from where he had planned to go. It didn't matter. He drove carefully through the rain, avoiding flooded streets, his mind racing with thoughts of his own struggles. He had nothing to offer her but a ride and a little warmth, but somehow that felt like enough. By the time they reached her house, a modest, worn-down home with a small porch, the rain had eased slightly. Henry got out and hurried to open her door, helping her to her feet. "Here, let me walk you inside." "No, dear, you've done enough," she said, smiling warmly despite her exhaustion. She reached into her purse, pulling out a few crumpled bills. "Please take this." Henry shook his head. "I can't take your money, ma'am. Just get inside and get warm." Tears welled up in her eyes as she clutched his hand for a moment. "You are a kind soul, young man. Thank you." She stepped inside and Henry turned back toward his car. He didn't expect anything in return. He didn't need anything. Just knowing he had helped was enough. Later that night, as he lay on his thin mattress in his cramped apartment, his phone buzzed. He sighed, assuming it was another rejection email, but something made him answer. "Is this Henry?" a deep voice asked. "Yes," he said cautiously. "Who's this?" "My name is Mr. Reynolds. You drove my mother home tonight." Henry sat up straight. "Oh, yes, sir. I did." There was a pause before Mr. Reynolds spoke again. "She told me about you, about how you helped her when no one else would. She also told me you refused to take her money." Henry rubbed the back of his neck. "It wasn't a big deal. I was just trying to help. To you, maybe, but to her, it meant everything." Another pause. "I'd like to meet you tomorrow. Can you come to my office?" Henry hesitated. He had no idea what this man wanted, but something in his voice told him it was important. "Yes, sir. I can be there." The next morning, Henry found himself standing in front of a towering glass building, feeling completely out of place in his worn-out jacket and scuffed shoes. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. A receptionist greeted him warmly and led him to a large office, where a man in a tailored suit waited. Mr. Reynolds extended his hand. "Thank you for coming, Henry. Please sit." Henry did as he was told, still unsure of what was happening. Mr. Reynolds studied him for a moment before speaking. "My mother is everything to me. She's given me more than I could ever repay. And last night, you made sure she got home safe when she needed help the most. That's not something I take lightly." Henry shook his head. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Mr. Reynolds said firmly. "They wouldn't have. He leaned forward. "I hear you're looking for work." Henry's breath caught in his throat. Yes, sir, I am." Mr. Reynolds smiled. "Then consider this your lucky day. I own a transportation company. We could use someone like you, someone with integrity, someone who does the right thing even when no one is watching." Henry stared at him, hardly believing what he was hearing. "Are you offering me a job?" "A stable job with benefits," Mr. Reynolds confirmed. "If you're interested." Henry didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Just the night before, he had been hopeless, struggling to keep his head above water. And now, because of one small act of kindness, everything was about to change. With a shaking hand, he reached across the desk and shook Mr. Reynolds' hand. "I'd be honored." As he left the office, stepping into the crisp morning air, he realized something. Sometimes life has a way of surprising us. Sometimes a simple act of kindness can set off a ripple effect that changes everything. And sometimes the best opportunities come when we least expect them. As he walked away, a small smile played at his lips. The storm had passed, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like the sun was finally shining again.